be here. When Jim invited me to, actually Sheila invited me to preach on Jim's behalf. And then to also teach, I said, what the heck, I'm here, let's just do it all at once. Now, I hope this, everybody gets, this is a bit of an ironic tongue-in-cheek title for starters. And I use America in this presentation, and that's a bit of a point also. Because, you know, if you understand, in Spanish, we are not Americans. We are estadounidenses, United Statesians. Being America and calling ourselves America is part of the arrogance of being God's favorite country. We get to claim the entire hemisphere. We're Americans. What about the Canadians and the Mexicans? To say nothing of the Southern Hemisphere. We won't go there. Anyway, so just with that at the beginning. So how did America become God's favorite country, or at least so we think? There's lots of threads to exploring the biblical, theological, and historical, and more. And we'll touch on a few of those here. We all probably know that the United States sort of began in 1620, there we go, with the arrival of the Pilgrims, who were, of course, Christians fleeing persecution in Europe and seeking refuge in the new land. Except that the first English settlement, of course, was not the Pilgrims. It was in Roanoke in 1585, 35 years earlier, and its whole purpose was to grow tobacco for commercial purposes. Commercial venture, this new tobacco, this thing they discovered in the New World, was very popular very quickly, and they wanted to grow it. That colony disappeared, known as the Lost Colony, followed by Jamestown in 1607, also meant to grow tobacco, not faith. It survived barely and then later became a city. And the Pilgrims were not actually fleeing religious persecution exactly. They had been living quite peacefully in the Netherlands for a generation or two, but their children were speaking Dutch instead of English, and they were not pleased with that, and they wanted to get someplace else. And they wanted to establish a peer society to not have to live with other less godly people, they thought. And admittedly, Christians in this era were not always nice to each other. Unfortunately, the Puritans and Pilgrims weren't always nice to other Christians either. And no one, for practical purposes, was very nice to the non-Europeans living in the New World. But the sense of being special and being chosen has roots long before 1620, and that's where we need to start. We need to think about the biblical models that people used in identifying themselves as this new Israel, the chosen land in the new place. So these are basically, if you can see, old Sunday school pictures of that sort of stuff. So they're not meant for great art, but just to remind us of things. But remember that the primary narrative of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, after they get to the opening pleasantries, the creation, the flood, so forth, we get to the core story that begins with Abraham, and his departure west from Ur the Chaldees for a promised land. And the heart of that story becomes the Exodus from Egypt, which culminates with the Passover. And let's remember that the Passover means the slaughter of all the firstborn of Egypt, and the passing over of the Hebrews, who could then escape from captivity and head for the promised land. It took another 40 years, but they got there. Exodus, escape to safety, God's providence and protection. That's the model. The Hebrews fought their way into the promised land, fighting wars, killing many, but eventually creating a governing nation in that place. And eventually they had a kingdom. Now you may recall God didn't want them to have a king, but the people did, and God relented, and we get Saul and David and Solomon, and then the kingdom divides and eventually is defeated by various greater powers, Babylon and others. The Hebrews, at least some of them, are exiled to Babylon, and this, for the Hebrews, is like being stuck in Egypt again. It's once again a time of exile from the promised land. And then there's a second exodus, so to speak, a return from exile to Jerusalem. This is told in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, has anybody ever heard a sermon preached on Ezra or Nehemiah? Rare, let me tell you. It's not what we do most of the time, but there are certain branches of Christianity that fixate on Joshua and Judges, the conquering of the promised land, and Ezra and Nehemiah, the recovery and return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So they do come back, as I say, as in Ezra and Nehemiah books. There's more defeats than a success when a Jewish state is reestablished. Then defeat for sure at the hands of Rome. And eventually, after the time of Jesus, another exile from the Holy Land. The Romans shut the Jews out because they've been committing too many revolutions. So after the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, Jews no longer had let me back up. So the basic story we're dealing with for Jews, Hebrews and Jews, and the one that the Christian story builds on, is that they're the chosen people. They've been oppressed in Egypt and in Babylon. They have emerged and come down, and they've formed a state, a nation with king, government, and so forth. Christians build on that, obviously. In the New Testament, we see ourselves as the new Israel, the follower to the old one. But it was a bit different at that point. Why? The Jewish story largely identified the people with the nation, with a nation state, kings, government. You know, the priests weren't the king, but to be a Hebrew and to be a Jew was to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to live in the kingdom which God had permitted under the kings that God had chosen. So it was a total identity, basically, of personal identity, religious identity, national identity, all the same. But when Christianity started, it came out of a Jewish community that was quite different. There was no Jewish state there. There were religious communities of Jews, but there was no longer a Hebrew nation that you could have allegiance to. Rome ran the state, not the Jews, and expected worship of the Roman gods for religion. But if you didn't actively fight against those gods, you could still be a Roman. Remember, the Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen, even as a Jew, had all the rights that came with that. But in general, by that point, the Jews were scattered across the empire because there was no nation to cluster around anymore. And so you have synagogues in lots of places, gatherings of Jews. This is where the disciples went, the apostles, early on. They went to synagogues to begin preaching the new version of their Hebrew faith. And, you know, think about Pentecost, where Jews from all sorts of cities, you know, had come to Jerusalem, all across the empire. And after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Jews not only didn't have a government to belong to, but they didn't even have any kind of geography to belong to, that they'd been pushed out. So the church is growing amongst local communities of believers. And it was among those communities that the gospels spread. It wasn't a national identity anymore. It was a religious and communal identity. My people gathering together on Saturdays at the synagogue on Sabbath. Now, the early church grew not through conquering the promised land, as the Hebrews had done 1,000 years plus earlier, but through personal connection and service to one another. See how these Christians love one another, said pagan observers, according to Tertullian, a Christian writer in the 2nd century. The early Christians saw themselves as the continuation of Israel as the chosen people, but as a community, not as a state for government. They had no political power whatsoever. But of course, before long, as we know, religion once again got entangled with the state. Constantine believed he saw an omen of God's favor before a battle, converted to this new Christian faith, made it the official religion of the empire. The church continued to grow, not only by the sword and with political backing, but included violence and politics. It actually took over 1,000 years more for all of Europe to become at least nominally Christian. But certainly by the time Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, The Europeans assumed that they were Christian, their leaders were Christian, and the government and the church were closely linked. Now, we all probably know about the Crusades into the Middle East. There was also a Northern Crusade because the Baltic peoples didn't convert very quickly. Lithuania was the last pagan nation in Europe and only converted in the 14th century. The last royal pagan funeral in Europe, the one where they put the king's body in a pyre and all of his horses and his shields and all that, was in like 1386 in Lithuania. So think about Europe actually was real Christian in the sense of depth of cultural content until really about the time of the Reformation breaks things up. But again, the real point is that these were communities in the early church, then becomes linked into political power. The state, and religion again is combined into one thing. And then we get the disruption of the church and of Western society with the Reformation, which we can put at 1517 and Martin Luther for simplicity's sake. Now, this was a religious event, obviously, but it was also a political event because it had long been assumed everyone should share the same faith and political force could and should be used to enforce it. Heretics were at risk of being killed, executed, and that had happened. And from the early 1500s, actually before that, but we don't get into the details, until 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War. So we're talking more than 125 years. And even beyond that, there were wars and physical disputes over both the Christian faith and who ruled the nation. So the religion wars were serious for a long time. And think about when the Pilgrims happened. The 30 Years' War is barely starting in Europe as they are leaving because of this, already century of upheavals, basically, in that part of the world. But about that time, in the early Reformation and after, on the Protestant side, there were those who wanted to withdraw from society, people we now know as the Mennonites or the Anabaptists. Some wanted to control society. Certainly that was the approach of John Calvin, and largely Martin Luther as well. And some were satisfied if they could worship and live in their own way. And some, like the Pilgrims and the Puritans, were not happy with pressure to live with bishops in the Anglican Church in England and wanted the opportunity for what they considered to be religious freedom. Freedom for them, not for other groups. Remember Roger Williams, that name ring a bell? He was thrown out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for too much independence of doctrine and fled to what became Rhode Island to start a new colony. So these new folks fighting for religious freedom were only interested in it for themselves, not for anybody else. So these groups of Christians who felt alienated and oppressed by the European leaders in whose lands they were in, identified themselves with the Hebrews in Egypt or the Jews in Babylon. They were themselves, as they saw it, reliving these biblical experiences of God's people. And to make it even better, there was a place to go. A new land, which they surely were convinced was promised to them by the God who had broken the power of Rome. First, of course, the Roman Empire back in the early centuries, and now had broken the power of the Roman Catholic Church, time of the Reformation. So North America was, they believed, a largely vacant land, just waiting for them to take as the promised land, just like it happened with the Hebrews coming out of the land of Egypt. And of course, it didn't actually even have to be vacant, because just as the Holy Land hadn't been vacant, but the Hebrew people conquered and even exterminated the peoples who were there because God had promised it to them. So violence was religiously legitimate. Now, I've seen nothing to prove that the Pilgrims were applying the doctrine of discovery, some of you may have heard of, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. That was really a Roman Catholic doctrine. It had some broader impact. But Protestants were very much interested, good Protestant fashion, in Bible teaching. Faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. And the Bible, as they saw it, the story of the Exodus and the Promised Land absolutely fit. And the first Promised Land was, as they said, taken by force and without mercy. For example, Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him cheerfully, for he thought, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel declared, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Now, we look at this as a awkward Bible story, shall we say. But there are folk who still take this rather seriously. I'm afraid to say it. I'll more to that in a minute. The same sort of thing happened in New England. In 1637, Puritans surrounded a settlement of Pequot people. Their leader, John Mason, snatched a torch from a Pequot wigwam and set fire to the village. This is from a history by John Russell Adams, a prominent colonial historian of the 20th century. In the early dawn, New England men stood guard over the flames. 500 men, women, and children were slowly burned alive. Ministers of Christ saluted one another in the Lord Jesus, some of them profiting directly from selling surviving Pequot boys and girls into slavery. This is proven history. This is not somebody's, exaggeration or an unfortunate mistake. And another historian, just as Canaan was wrested from the hands of heathens through sacral violence, the Reverend Joshua Moody advocated infanticide as a wartime strategy, writing that, quote, "the brats of Babylon may more easily be dashed against the stones if we take the season forward. But if we let them grow up, they will become formidable and hardly conquerable." Now that is a direct quote from Psalm 137. Now you probably know 137, or you think you do. We all remember the pop song, right? By the rivers of Babylon, etc. And it's a lovely song. It's often read, like fresh fruit convocation on the first day of college. With all these kids who've just left home and they're starting someplace new. So, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, our home. On the willows there, we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." But then we get, after this lovely part of Jerusalem and all, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, raise it down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, the devastator, happy shall he be who requites you with what you have done to us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. And this is being quoted today in Israel as a justification for killing children. Because the children will grow up. The boys will grow up to be warriors. The women will grow up to have more children who will grow up to be warriors and enemies of Israel. This is an active position that's being taken by a number of, admittedly, the extreme right, but they happen to run the government right now. But this was the same attitude that our own, Pilgrim and Puritan ancestors adopted. That the Bible provided justification for violence and violently taking over this country and people and even killing children. Get them when they're young. They're easier to kill then. Now, there were plenty of attacks on both sides, as, indeed, there were scriptures telling of the entry into the promised land, that there was fights both ways. The Edomites killed Hebrews killed Edomites, etc. So the Indians attacked the settlers also, but the English had better weapons, and together with the effects of imported diseases and such, the Puritans and newer arrivals were confident that God was on their side, and that they were indeed the new Israel. Cotton Mather was, you probably recall from 8th grade U.S. history or something, learned Hebrew to study the Hebrew scriptures and determined that New England, quote, fulfills the type of Israel materially. So we're dealing with physical reality. Yes, this fits the new Israel, so we can imitate it. He believed the Puritans, like the Hebrews making their exodus from Egypt, had fled slavery under the Church of England in order to establish communities, quote, for the exercise of the Protestant religion according to the light of their consciences, in the deserts of America. Now, that term deserts, of course, is important. The idea that the land was vacant and for the taking, which of course it wasn't, but that was the perception at the time. A prominent historian of the period wrote in 1921, as the whites increased in numbers and comparative power, and as their first fears of the savages and the desire to convert them gave place to dislike, contempt, spiritual indifference, and self-confidence, it was no longer necessary to treat the Indian as an equal. The lands of the Indians gradually came to be looked upon as reservations, upon which their native owners were allowed to live until a convenient opportunity or the growing needs of the settlers might bring about a further advance. So it was just sort of, you're there until we want it more. Now, here's where the intellectual history comes into play. The colony was still a religious community, and the church had always seen itself as the new Israel, the successor to, the chosen people. That's just kind of basic, legitimate, Christian understanding. We see ourselves as the next step in God's relationship with people. But then eventually, so those things were religious communities. We're the new Israel, and we're imitating the old Israel, even though we actually aren't a government or a state. But then the Hebrew people were either coming out of Egypt, so that's all okay. But eventually, religion is disestablished. And most of us think that happened with the Constitution, separation of church and state. But that actually was only at the federal level. The states, a number of them, kept established churches. Massachusetts was the last to get rid of an established church, in that case congregational, in 1833. Up until then, that was the official religion of the Massachusetts colony, and it's been stayed. But the point here is, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when the church was no longer the official religion, but it was the common, the idea of God's special care for America, special providence for America as a country, as a nation, became more prominent for this otherwise multi-religion, multi-ethnic community. And by that point, you had Maryland, which was Catholic. You had Pennsylvania, William Penn had tolerated any religion. So you've got a mixed group now, but this sense of a national identity was building as well. So rather than God's special providence for the church alone, congregational, up in New England, Presbyterian in Pennsylvania and such, it now became God's special providence for the country. Now, the American Revolution, most of the thinking behind the Constitution were actually far more indebted to Enlightenment thinking, deism, really, than to the Bible. But the Puritan history and their concept of the new Israel for a people fleeing the old world, for a promised land, even as Abraham had fled Ur, became the best possible explanation for not just the church's success, but the nation's. If we're so successful, it must be because God loves us. As one scholar said, even such a foe of organized religion as Thomas Paine, Tom Paine, Common Sense, Paine rejected the Bible, and especially the Old Testament. But even he could not resist the use of Puritan genealogy to speak of America's chosen destiny. There's this idea of the chosen people coming out of the darkness of Europe and coming onto this new land was just too good a story, and it became the dominant one. And this sense of following the biblical history of the successful domination of the promised land by the Hebrews was soon connected with the rapid progress and the success of the American nation in the 19th century as well. Herman Melville, whom most of us know only as the author of Moby Dick, that's all I know, he was also a public thinker and commenter as well. And he wrote at one point, "We Americans are peculiar chosen people." Remember, peculiar had a different meaning then. It meant special, not weird. We are the Israel of our time. And as the world was to be blessed by the descendants of Abraham, isn't that what God said? You will be a blessing to the nations. Now the world will be blessed with the success of the new Israel in the new promised land. He wrote, long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves and doubted whether indeed the political Messiah had come. But he has come in us. And let us always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in the history of the earth, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. For we cannot do a good to America, but we give alms to the world. Kind of a complex sentence, but think about that for a minute. We are so much God's chosen country that national selfishness is actually good for everybody, because God is working through us to take care of this whole world, just like he promised to Abraham back in Genesis 12. So you get this shift from a nation under God, which is still what we tend to say, but now we've got the nation as God's incarnation on earth, the nation as the Messiah. We are now the presence of God in the political sphere, as far as from Melville and many of his era. And if you want to, check on this, go back and read the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It's in the hymn. And just the amount of religious density in that, and that sense that the North, which sees itself, that's where the Pilgrims landed in the North. So the North gets to set the story, so to speak. You see that divine hand is behind all these actions of the people who are fighting against, the South, the people who really represent New Israel, fighting to put down what has been determined to be wrong. This sense of a special providential role stretches across political parties and policies. There was then, and there continues up to today, a separatist or isolationist stream of thought in the United States that still sees the New World as a refuge from the wars and the decadence of old world of Europe. The Know Nothing Party in the 1850s, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, and again in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh's America First movement in the 1930s, anti-immigrant movements since World War II, and we're seeing another surge right now, did and sadly still do exist. But they, along with these more messianic types, still share the idea of God's special care for America. They just have a narrower and adamantly Protestant and decidedly Caucasian understanding of what constitutes America, but the same idea of we're a special and chosen people. And meanwhile, the idea of America as God's favorite country, combined with the missionary efforts of Christianity, has dominated our political life, especially since World War II, and encouraged a sense that our nation should and does reflect God's will for the world. Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, called us the indispensable country. Quote, we stand taller and see further, unquote. So much for walking humbly with God. More recently, Robert Kagan, a prominent Jewish writer, called for the United States to accept its necessary role as the global policeman. It's simply our responsibility, it says, not our desire. But somebody's got to do it, and we're the only realistic option. Now, this is a little bit of Herman Melville, again, to do good for America is to do good for the world. But it's also a little bit like Rudyard Kipling and the white man's burden. One couplet of which says, it's the white man's burden of bringing civilization to your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. And we wonder why we, don't find the global South terribly happy with the old Western colonial powers, when that's the attitude. But to back up a little bit from today and to get down to what's in here. Up until, let's say, 1954, with the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruling, and then even more critically, the 1962 ruling barring public-led prayer in schools, the American public school system had arguably been the dominant institution shaping American public life for 150 years or more. And it was effectively the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant school system. Varying degrees of intensity in varying places, but it was. It represented the broad sweep of WASP, Old Northeast, East Coast culture, with the morning prayers and the pledge and all of that stuff. But as the American population became more diverse and the role of religion weakens over this time, some Christian groups in America have become increasingly concerned about the decline of public virtue and the decline in religious influence. And since America is God's favorite country, the new Israel, any sign of national problems must be because we have turned away from God. As with ending prayer in schools or making divorce a no-fault process rather than a moral dispute, or certainly approving same-sex marriage, anything like that. So for decades now, we have heard the need to revive what supposedly was the once godly nature of American life. Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and more pushed this understanding, with politicians like George Wallace running on the same approach. Let's remember, George Wallace won a number of electoral votes in 1968 from a number of states. He was not just the governor of Alabama, Georgia, whatever. So they all ran on the same approach of, our national virtue has failed, and they had, of course, a healthy dose of white racism in there as well. Since the 1970s, some Christians have become increasingly focused on implementing a particular understanding of the Bible as our legal system. The most prominent effort today is called the Seven Mountain Mandate. This Case for Christian Nationalism is one example of the books written on this issue. The Seven Mountain Mandate has been getting more attention recently. It started about 1975, but really became visible in about the year 2000, and has grown a lot in the last 10 years. And this movement believes that Christians should dominate 7 areas of public life: media, education, government, and so on. And that the civil law should be determined by their particular understanding of Christian beliefs and values. It's also known as the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, you will see. Minnesota's own Michelle Bachmann is a part of this movement, as is the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and a number of Donald Trump's spiritual advisors. Now, one of the points that we need to remember here is that, remember, this is all based on this biblical model, as they see it, and as we have seen it for our whole history. We're imitating how the Hebrews emerged out of first Ur, then Egypt, into the Holy Land. But of course, remember that Israel was not a democracy. There was nothing remotely approaching voting in ancient Israel or Israel at any point. So if we are God's new Israel, the chosen people in a promised land, democracy is not essential. It's not part of the package. It might even be a mistake if it prevents America from following God in the way I or my group believes America should function. Democracy becomes a problem, not a solution. Christian nationalism becomes not a force for democracy, seeking political participation by people of faith in public discussions about how we rule ourselves, which is a perfectly fair and reasonable thing to do, but it becomes rather a judgment on democracy as a failing system which does not bring about the godly nation that God intended for the first Israel and also intends for the new Israel, us. So we find ourselves convinced that we are God's favorite, but we're uncertain how to live that out in a time of polarization, outrage, and anger. A ecumenical group of Christians recently prepared a statement that provides a positive case for democracy as a governing system that Christians should support for theological reasons, not political, theological reasons. The statement starts with all people being created in the image of God, Imago Dei. The essential starts, so thus everybody deserves equal participation in making decisions about their community. And we are all prone to error, my favorite doctrine, so no person or system of thought should dominate. The gospel advances through persuasion and example, as in the early church, before Constantine got involved, So governmental coercion or force should have no place in the church or society. And it goes on from there. You could go to faithdemocracy.net or Google Christian Faith and Democracy, and you'll find the statement. The statement was actually led by a guy named Jim Wallace. Some of you may recognize that. He's a longtime, prominent, socially active evangelical, but on the sort of progressive side of that in terms of social witness and such. He's now actually at Georgetown, a Catholic institution in Washington, D.C., and he pulled together a group of people who prepared this statement on faith and democracy, like that. 4 pages long. But it's actually a nicely done piece. And I think one of the pieces of this Christian nationalism issue that really doesn't get enough attention, broadly speaking, religions don't actually like democracy. Religions like to be in charge. Most of us, I believe in God. God tells me what I'm supposed to do, and we should all do that. Tends to be the approach. The Roman Catholic Church did not officially approve of democracy as a legitimate form of government for Catholics to support until 1893. Not all that long ago, historically speaking. I mean, the idea was that the good people, the church hierarchy and the magistrates who observed the proper patterns of the church hierarchy should run the place, not the common people. And there are people in this Seven Mountain Mandate stuff today who basically are saying the same thing, that everybody doesn't deserve a share. It's the job of the magistrates to run the country. And everybody else just kind of has to live with that. So this is going to be, the interesting thing about this statement is it actually breaks some new theological ground in providing a positive case for democracy. Because for a lot of particularly Protestants, think about where we came from ancestrally. We come from Europe, Catholics dominate, Protestants are fighting against the Catholic Church. We're in our view, and we're being persecuted, oppressed, what have you. So we want a legal system that protects minorities. And that's a good thing about democracy if they work well, but it's fundamentally a defensive position. It's not telling what you would do if you actually ran things. If you were in control, you would probably run roughshod for lots of things. So the defense of democracy as a defensive position is a defensive position. It doesn't have an affirmative agenda. Whereas this statement is trying to say, no, there's a reason to support democracy. And that's what we need to do, is to have an affirmation that everybody matters, everybody counts. But that's part of what we're dealing with at the moment in this battle over Christian nationalism, which is particularly weird, of course, because the people pushing it are all sort of backing one particular candidate, even though the candidate himself probably has no grasp of what this stuff's about at all. Clearly is not a student of these matters. And yet, were he to be elected, we would probably see a lot of these folks pushing their agenda, whether successfully or not is a whole different issue, I realize, but we're going to see that agenda under, getting a lot of pressure and push behind it, and require a lot of rearguard actions to defeat it. So that's what I had to say, and I figured we'd have some time for conversation and questions and comments and other points of view, as people wish. Yes.
If this is supposed to be such a great thing that these certain group runs the government, what model in the history of the world has that ever been successful?
Well, that's a very good question. And that is, even, if you go back, could go back to Israel, since that's where this wants to come from, and say, well, it only lasted 3 kings were there. And the first one went crazy, Saul. And then you had David, who was, somewhat less than an entirely admirable figure. And then you had Solomon, had his challenges too, but he was a great builder. And after that, the kingdom splits, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, this is the classic problem of the goal of power is, of course, not always exercised by the person who's on the throne. You know, there's always the people maneuvering behind, or the people seeking influence, or, you know, trying to get the king to do what they want. And everybody, we all want power, you know, it's a pretty basic human desire. And so somebody's gonna want power and they're gonna figure out what's the best way we can get it. Those situations don't tend to stay stable. And that's your point, I think, which is true. But even now, I think, not just here, but in other places too, we're seeing a resurgence of people saying we cannot trust the public voice. We want to control it in ways that ensure that only a minority of people are actually making any decisions. And as for my lifetime, however old one might be, that would be good enough. But of course, for my kids or my grandkids, it may not be quite so good. The same problem will re-arise. Yeah.
Where does the phrase separation of church and state come into this discussion? How does that work? Is that anything legitimate or is that just something people say?
People say, no, I think it's very legitimate. I mean, to be precise, I think the phrase in the Constitution is that the government, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The separation of church line, which is standard and common, I think is actually specifically out of, it's either Thomas Jefferson or George Washington.
Thomas Jefferson.
It is Jefferson. And so there's that line from Jefferson. One of the things that isn't in our Constitution, but I did a lot on Virginia, of course, we hear about Jefferson all the time. The Virginia Statute of Toleration, which Thomas Jefferson wrote, which is an even more explicit discussion of separating personal religion and state affairs, is considered one of his great writing accomplishments, along with the Declaration. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then there's also the George Washington famous letter to the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island, I think, where he said, we are not a Christian country. You Jews are legitimate participants in the body politic, and you should vote and so forth. So there is an effort on the part of these sorts of folk to say, well, that the Constitution was really all written by Christians and has a Christian background and can only be properly understood in a Christian framework, which is really wrong. I mean, that's just historically false. The dominant influence on people writing the Constitution at the time they wrote it was really what we call deism. It wasn't atheism. They didn't believe in God, but they certainly did not believe in connecting it to a personal relationship with Jesus, or what we think of as sort of Christianity today. They believed there was a God, he was mostly a clockmaker, and he created the universe. It's our job to figure out what to do, with the rest of it. So they were not, for the most part, professing Christians in a doctrinal sense. They probably were not antagonistic. It's a lot harder to do that, although there were some that were. I mean, Jefferson was clearly a Christian. He had his favorite sections of the New Testament, but he thought the Old Testament was total nonsense. Thomas Paine, same thing. A number of others like that. So the claim that our founding documents are inherently Christian is just made up and very, very bad history. So that does not mean, obviously, that religious people cannot participate in public affairs. Always have, always will. But this claim that we need to establish a single dominant way of doing things for the sake of our understanding of our religion, on the part of this kind of group, is really only leads you down one path, and that's towards a religious dictatorship, which clearly has all sorts of problems of people reacting against it. Americans are not going to tolerate it. The only way you get those sorts of things is in countries like Iran or some others, or Afghanistan, where you have a government that really will lay down the law. But that requires a level of public tolerance. It's not agreement that I don't think you're going to get in the United States. we're a little too independent minded for that. Other thoughts, questions?
Bill.
Comments? Yeah,
This is a question of semantics that
yeah.
has concerned me for a long time. How do we get the word Jew out of Hebrew?
It partly, a good question. I actually had to look that up the other day myself and remember why this happens. They both come from Hebrew. But Jew was a version of the Hebrew Ivri that came through Greek and then Latin spelling. So the shift in the way that initial letter was heard and spelled ended up shifting from the Hebrews to the Jews in about the time of Babylon, actually even. Also, of course, Hebrew died out as a spoken language and was replaced by Aramaic, which gave a different set of sort of in some of the initial vowels. And, Semitic languages basically use 3 consonant chunks, and then you put a bunch of vowels somewhere in there to change the form of the word. But it's very easy if you have an initial sound like an H, it's very easy to lose that. Like the English drop their H's. That's the old song in My Fair Lady. So you lose the H, what you're left with. You're left with E, and then it's sort of a B, which easily becomes a V. And so it gets a shift in sound over time, but they're actually both out of the Hebrew Semitic language origin.
Thank you.
Yeah, Richard.
It's all very depressing.
Yeah.
It seems like for thousands of years, we've all been killing each other over who gets to have this chosen
Yeah,
word.
yeah.
Where's your hope?
Well, that's a good question. If I can repeat the question? Yeah, it seems that for thousands of years, people have been killing each other over religious disputes, claims of who's right and who's wrong. So where is the hope in this arrangement? That's a very good question, because it is, I'm not being very hopeful these days, and I'm not sure whether I'm getting am I getting old and curmudgeonly, or is this rational?
My kids would say,
Yeah, there's the hope, yeah,
for your kids and your grandchildren, our kids and our grandchildren.
right.
We may be short on this earth, but they are.
They are, exactly. We get the 2 things here, among others, many others. One is theology. What does it mean to advocate amongst other believers to say the point of religious belief is to orient our life in the direction of doing kindness and walking justly. And so that's the point, whatever your religion is. And it's sort of like, people have been saying for decades, no kid wants to be bullied. No parent wants their child not to read. So let's focus on what we want to have happen and do that and figure out how those things can be accomplished. And how I justify my particular understanding of the holy, or the ultimate forces that guide the universe, is my business and the people who support me in that. But it's not our business to tell other people how to do it. The church grew quite successfully and dramatically for 300 years, without having political power behind it. Why do we now need political power behind it? There must be something wrong with that, rather than saying our model should start in 325 or 320, whatever, with the baptism of Constantine. So there's the theology fight to carry on within religious circles, and other religions can do this too. And some of them are a little bit. There's an organization in Indonesia called Nahdlatul Ulama. It's the largest Islamic clerical organization in the world. Got like 70 million members. So we're having a lot. And they are attempting to convince the larger Muslim community. Remember, there's no Vatican for Muslims. There's nobody who can set out doctrine from the top. But they are making an active effort at encouraging people to recognize that it's time to rewrite some Sharia law. And for example, they're trying to get rid of the term, saying we gotta quit using the term kafir, means infidel, or heretic, and talk about citizens. We have fellow citizens. It's not Muslims and Kafirs living in the same land. It's Muslims and fellow citizens living in the same land, attempting to manage a complicated modern country. So there are people who are trying that there. I mean, most American Jews have done that for, generations. The task is to have a healthy society, not to run the country. Unfortunately, Jews in Israel, a certain number of them, I would assert, are demonstrating the problem that most religions don't actually like democracy. They just want to be in charge. And that's what's happening. And we're getting Psalm 137 brought back to justify, the killings in Gaza and elsewhere. At the rate we're going, we're going to be seeing the depopulation of the West Bank for long. And then what are we going to do about that? Since this is all happening under our umbrella. That's, closely related, actually, because one of the reasons I think so many Christians in the United States, particularly evangelical Christians, support what Israel's up to, is because that's their lived experience, their mental lived picture of America. We took over the Holy Land, just like the Hebrews took over the Holy Land, then they lost it, and now they're getting it back again, and just like we got this, so it makes perfectly good sense to them to take over, the Holy Land. It's not seen as, that was then and this is now, and are we really wanting to say that we, public prayer the other day, public stoning, God's plan for a prison-free world. Look it up on Amazon. I'm not kidding. It's really there. I thought it was Orwell. But it's not. He said, public stoning will make sure people don't commit more crimes. We won't need prisons. We get to save all that money and deploy it to more useful purposes. My, I thought that was quite a hit. Yes. Please.
Social media has exacerbated the efforts of groups like us and stuff like that. I would say the flip side to that coin is that we were all raised in, public schools and in generations where the information that and been experienced was told to you, taught to you. We're in an era now where everything going on in the world in video form is on full display. Our kids and our grandkids have access to information that we could not have imagined as children. So, I grew up, in public school where they handed me a history book and they said, the Pilgrims came and had this lovely meal with Native Americans and they kind of switched off to the side for us. We all know that that's absolutely not true, but like me growing up and probably you all too.
Yeah.
It took a nominal amount of effort to go figure out that was full of crap. That's not the case these days.
No.
Right now, we have access to, our children have access to, our grandkids have access to people sending us videos from all over the world of exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And that is changing people's perceptions and will continue to change people's perceptions. I think the flip side of the terrible propaganda coin is that people are going to come out of this generation knowing more and being able to stand up more for what they know is the truth than we ever had access to.
That's a good. That's a fascinating, very good point. Very well put. Thank you. And let me put it in another historical context. If you go back to, it's generally accepted that the invention of the movable printing press, Gutenberg, changed society. That everybody agrees on that, one way or the other. Now, it wasn't easy. You just like today, they make a case that, the printing press also made possible a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And, stuff could get printed that nobody wanted. And it's certainly, without the printing press, you would not have had a Protestant Reformation, for good or for ill, but certainly you wouldn't have had it. Because the ability to distribute information and to send your arguments hundreds of miles away, relatively easily wouldn't have occurred. But as I started out that talk, there were wars of religion for 100+ years after the Reformation. So that transition period was not necessarily fun or easy. It gave, but it happened, and it gave us the modern world in various ways. So I think you're onto something there. We are going to go through a very difficult period while we all learn to cope with the misinformation, the disinformation, the fact that we can't control narratives, the way we used to. And having a narrative is kind of a necessary thing in some respects. You need a sense of, every question cannot be open for discussion every day. You gotta have a sense of what you believe, how you live, what things you're gonna work on, but you also want to be open to new ideas. But you gotta have some level of consistency, some level of novelty and newness and opportunity. And getting to that balance, to return to some kind of balance. I think we are at one of these, 500-year shake-up periods. I think it's Phyllis Triple, religion writer, who may not be dead, I can't remember. But she wrote a book 25, 30 years ago. She said about every 500 years, the church has a attic clearing rummage sale. And she was talking church history, obviously. And the Reformation was one piece of that. And what's happening in a lot of places in the church, in the late 2000s, late 1900s, early 2000s, is another period of that happening. And technology is probably the central piece of that. Along with travel, we go places and we learn things, we see people we couldn't see 50 years ago. The money, that freedom of travel, 100 years ago, certainly not. So yeah, that's a good point. But I guess it still leaves us all with the challenge of how do we get from here to there? And how do we not lose hope? Because there is a certain amount of that going on. A friend of mine who follows this more than I do said that some people looking at the electorate these days say 20% of the voters are chaos voters. They want chaos because they just see everything being a mess, and they'd be happy to have somebody just come in and, take over the pile of soup cans. And it's an understandable attitude, but not necessarily a very helpful attitude. So, how do we deal with something?
Bill, it seems, bringing it to the present moment.
Yeah.
The concept of making America great again
Mhm.
would go to the basis of restoring white male Christian to Christianity in this country.
Absolutely. And that's what, it's a huge piece of this is keep making sure the patriarchy stays in charge. Or gets back fully in charge, that it's losing its weird. I was at an event yesterday with Keith Ellison, who said something about, he said he thought misogyny and patriarchy were far more important in this election than people were recognizing. And somebody came back to him later and said, "Is that really what he meant?" He said, "Yeah." He says that he thinks there's a lot deeper sense of that alienation of younger males, a sense of change. He waxed eloquently, and I like Keith, he's not the best speaker always, but he waxed eloquently about how much better life was for young men when they had able, capable women who made more money than they did, and that was fine. And how much better their life was than their grandfather, who felt he would have to handle everything, et cetera. So he made a good case, but he was worried about this. And I think it's a real issue. And yeah, I'm not going into politics per se, but the issue of if you believe that we're trying to basically reestablish the biblical kingdom, in Jerusalem, well, who's in charge. And it ain't women. For all of the women's roles you can find in scripture, still. Yeah, please.
I think that's to Carolyn's question too, about why do people do this and it's not sustainable? It's not necessarily sustainable. It benefits a very specific group of people for it to be a short amount of time, and that's all those people are concerned about. Well, like you said, it's power.
Yeah, it's power.
I'm gonna do whatever I can to make my 5 friends really, really comfortable and safe, and I don't care what happens afterwards. That's the reason.
Yeah, and the hunger for power, I think, is what really has deformed the church. A faithful church would be a community gathering for support and encouragement, education and service and all of that, but the goal would not be power. But, in any of the major churches, this includes us, but, even though we don't think so maybe, but, assets, power, land, tax-free, it's all sorts of stuff where power is what we're after. I think it's known and I think we have to quit.